One way that I see this happening more, I'm sure across campus especially, is on how we engage with AI. One of the things that I found as I'm teaching this new first-year Odyssey course is that the examples that I used for alternative facts, boy, there's a lot more examples of alternative facts now that there's AI, right? There's everything from the AI generated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to People, Parasites, and Plagues, a podcast aimed at delivering information about the fascinating pathogens among us from the scientists who study them. I am Kim Klanowski.
And I am David Peterson, your host for today's episodes. In an era of alternative facts and fake news, evidence-based research is our last anchor to reality. Today's guest shows us why claims need scrutiny and proof matters more than persuasion.
Our guest today is Dr. Erik Ness, Director and Professor of Higher Education at the McBee Institute of Higher Education at the University of Georgia. Erik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Erik, the one question we always like to start our guests off with is to tell us about what happened in their pathway to their career. Did you kindergarten, you knew you wanted to get into policy, or?
No. I was a political science major at North Carolina State. And as a high school student, I was very interested in politics, just following politics casually, and became really interested in ideas and politics of how decisions happen, and pursued that in college. And I won't give you the full rundown of that, but I took a meandering path, considering being a high school history teacher or a lawyer, and found my way in higher education programs, and eventually decided that the policy interests are what really grabbed me. I had the fortunate event of when I was in my doctoral program, I had the opportunity to study under someone who was really pushing our field to think more theoretically, conceptually about how change happens and the political forces behind that. And at the same time, I was working as a policy analyst at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission at a time when Tennessee was deciding whether and how to adopt a Hope-style scholarship program. So I kind of got to see the sausage be made by day, in the legislature and with the state system office, and had the traditional doctoral experience side by side where I had trainings in theory and methods and higher education policy.
That sounds so cool that you were on this Tennessee Higher Education Commission. That's probably pretty unusual for a graduate student, but that sounds cool.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It probably is unusual for graduate students broadly. In our field, an applied field, we, in the McBee Institute, we have several current students and graduates who work in the University System of Georgia and in other offices like that across the country. And I was at Vanderbilt there in Nashville in Tennessee. And so it wasn't unusual for our program, but it is unusual in the broader kind of university community to have that direct kind of policy, state level policy connection to institution level policies.
So after you served in this capacity and got your degree, did that experience inform your decision to seek a career in academia?
I was really at a dilemma, fork in the road, so to speak, of whether I was going to, because I ended up working full-time at the Tennessee Higher Ed Commission in my last few years in graduate school, and thought that I might pursue a career in state policy and, working at a think tank or other type policy organization. But I kept my, kind of scholarly interest and so forth. I'll tell a quick story. My advisor, Michael McClendon, was amazing. And he had this phrase that I use sometimes with students. And when I told him of my dilemma of whether or not to pursue a faculty career or work in kind of state policy and so forth, he said to drink deeply from the well where I'm training. And that what he meant by that was that you're in a PhD program that is designed to prepare you to be a thoughtful, rigorous scholar. And if you pursue that, no door will close because of that. That you will be well positioned. If you choose to go into policy and continue in that realm, that won't hold you back. And you have to do that if you want to pursue a faculty career. And I tried to take that advice and ended up applied for several positions. I got one interview, and thankfully they hired me at the University of Pittsburgh.
So you started your career. What are the main questions addressed by your research? You can think historically or currently. So I'll let you take that one.
Yeah. So, Broadly, how I describe my research agenda is that I'm interested in both the public policy process of how decisions are made, and I'm interested in public policy effects. What are the intended or unintended outcomes of policies? And so I've pursued those two streams of research, taking on different topics. And so as I mentioned earlier, the topic for my dissertation work and my early work was on merit-based scholarships and how states decided on the criteria for those Hope-style scholarship programs, and had done some work on the effects of the criteria and who is eligible for different sets of criteria and what that means for their outcomes for students and for institutions and state goals as well. I've also studied, broader college completion policies here in Georgia. There was an initiative, I think it's still going on, called the Complete College Georgia, and so had a 5-state study to examine the use of research evidence in 5 different states, southeastern states, that were adopting broader statewide college completion policies. And so that's where a lot of my interest in research evidence, alternative facts and fake news, it kind of stems from that project. Since then, I've also studied things like the authorization of non-public institutions at the state level, and more recently focusing on ways that entities promote the value of higher education more broadly. I'll stop it more broadly.
So I know the completion rate is super important. We actually, in my college, we had the new dean come by and talk to us today. And one of the points he put up was how proud UGA was of their, I think, 5-year completion rate. And I know on graduate council, where we both served, that came up as well. And I remember having a lot of discussions about that. So where am I going with this, Kim?
Well,
I don't know where you're going with that.
I can jump in real quick.
Excellent.
With that, yeah.
This is why we have guests.
This is, the figure that we used a lot when I was in Tennessee was talked about the pipeline and where the cracks in the pipeline occur. So the figure, these aren't exact figures, but they're roughly close. If you take 100 ninth graders, we would say, how many of them graduate from high school? And it varies by state, but in Tennessee at the time, I recall it was somewhere between 65 and 70%. And so of those 65 or 70 students, how many come back the next year for college? That's the 1-year retention rate, which UGA fares very well. And I think we got up to 90% this past year. And so that in Tennessee, on average at the time, that dropped it down. If it was 70 that go to college, now you're down to 55 or 60 who come back for year 2. And then of that 55 or 60, how many graduate within 6 years is the federal kind of window there. How many graduate within 6 years? And it dropped all the way down below 40%. And so of 90, of 100 ninth graders, fewer than 40 of them ultimately will get a degree, a bachelor's degree. So those cracks in the pipeline were always alarming to audiences when they heard those the first time. And you could show by state how that varies. And in some states, there's a lower proportion that graduate high school because the dropout rate is so high. And in other states, there are more that graduate, but then fewer that go on to college. Still other states, take more time to complete or they don't complete. And so that helped analysts and researchers and folks who work in systems and campuses to better think about ways to support students to be successful at each step along the pipeline there.
So all the evidence there would inform policy that would hopefully have the goal of increasing this graduation rate. This retention rate.
That's right. I didn't think about that pipeline in quite that way, but you're exactly right. And one of the concepts is we think about the use of research evidence that I've used to kind of anchor my work. Is there's some of the early studies in the 1970s and 80s were conducted by Carol Weiss. There's a great article that refers to her as the godmother of this type of work, and she truly was. And she came up with some of the different ways in which evidence is used. And it's been boiled down to 3 of them. The 3 forms of evidence are instrumental use, like a silver bullet approach. A state is trying to decide what project they should implement to increase the graduation rate. And one study says, you have to encourage full-time enrollment. So everyone encourages full-time enrollment now. The other one is conceptual use, where over time, policymakers just begin to appreciate the understanding of research. And I think that's where that pipeline figure came in, because we gave that presentation so often that policymakers, it began to sink in that this is a problem. And they could focus on different points of the way to kind of show that college access is something that needs our attention and needs a whole host of different policy solutions, to solving those cracks in the pipeline. The last one is, I think, the most gets a lot of interest is the political and tactical use of information or non-use of information. And that's something that, Carol Weiss found in the 1970s when she was doing this initial work. And my works found evidence of that in more current times as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, thinking about what we're thinking with science and science policy from our perspective, we can certainly see that. So would you say that the instrumental use, that's kind of the easy way out?
The silver bullet. That's
right?
If you get inconclusive evidence that wearing a seatbelt leads to fewer, fatalities on the highway, and there are series of studies that show that conclusively, then the evidence is there. And it's
okay.
kind of, yeah.
Okay. And then the other one just requires a little bit more work or a little bit more thought, I guess you could imagine.
Thought and
creativity, maybe.
Creativity, maybe, but also just prolonged engagement.
Right.
If you sit on in this case for my field, if you sit on the education committee in a legislature for multiple terms, Louise McBee is who our institute is named after. She served as ultimately the chair of the Higher Education Committee. And she served, I think, 5 terms in that office. And now she needed no enlightenment. She came there knowing, more about higher education. But if another legislator found themselves on a committee and didn't have independent knowledge about that topic, which is reasonable, and then by virtue of being on that committee for multiple sessions and showing up to the meetings and hearing expert testimony, the idea is that over time, the conceptual use, or they call it the enlightenment, use, that you just begin to understand more about that area.
So you teach, for those who don't know, we have what's called a first-year Odyssey class. So all first-year students into the University of Georgia take this class, and there's a variety of topics that are offered. They get to choose, not necessarily something that's their major or something that they plan on studying, just something that maybe interests them. And it's another way of faculty getting to know students, let's be honest, right, and making that connection as well. So your first-year Odyssey class, which you did win a teaching award for, by the way, was on research evidence, alternative facts, and fake news. So I think this is maybe where our listeners might see some connection to some things that we are dealing with in science. And you are certainly one of our first guests from a social science department. So we'll be very clear about that. So our listeners may say, and you maybe thought this as well, what does that have to do with people, parasites, and plagues? But I don't think we spend enough time talking about people, right? And this is really what we're going to be talking about for this next section, because, for example, policy decisions about scientific evidence are made by people.
That's right.
And that affects people and can be skewed, right, by people who are maybe not listening and not hearing these things enough, or looking for the magic silver bullet. So how did you cover this topic in your class?
Yeah, I started teaching this class in 2015, and it grew out of a project I mentioned earlier, the project of how research evidence was used in different states, about college completion projects. And I thought that I was curious what students might think about it. And so I had 2 main things that I really loved about this class. Incidentally, I should say I'm now teaching a separate first-year Odyssey class on AI in higher education. But what I loved about the research evidence, alternative facts, and fake news course is what I call dueling policy memos. And so the main assignments for the class were 2 policy memos, 2 pages each, single-spaced. Pick a topic, any topic you want, and students took advantage of that. It was usually topics on broader kind of social issues, everything from abortion to refugees to immigration to whether athletes should be paid, or just a real kind of grab bag of topics. And they had to write the first memo arguing for a set of recommendations that would inform that position. So let's say they chose abortion as their topic and they had pro-choice set of recommendations. Then their second memo would have to be written from the perspective of pro-life and make arguments for pro-life recommendations. And the idea was to force people to think about the evidence that they would use to support those positions. And so often when I would ask people after they'd done both the assignments, which one was easier to write, not surprisingly, the majority of them felt like usually the first memo they wrote was the one that they really agreed with. And then they said the second one was tough because they didn't agree with those recommendations,
right.
but really had to think about what evidence they felt like would be compelling to offer that. And so I think that was interesting. Then the other thing that I did in the class is set up 2 kind of mini debates where we would vote as a class on topics that they were interested in. I would assign people to kind of the pro and con group, and they would have to they had spent one class period meeting with their teams and trying to, again, think of the evidence that they wanted to bring. And then the second class period, we had 2 debates. This was after a session. The other session that I really liked was a 2-part session on the policy organizations and how they use evidence. To be more specific, the ideologically driven policy organizations. And so I've done some work with Denisa Gondola, a former student and now outstanding professor at University of Texas, Austin. And Denisa and I did an analysis, 50-state analysis of think tanks, state-level think tanks, one of which were organized all by conservative networks and the other organized by progressive networks. And so in this first-year Odyssey class, I would have folks read examples of that from organizations here in Georgia that aligned with separate entities and think about how their points of view inform the evidence that they provide to support those points of view. And so they had that in mind as they were building their own memos or their debate talking points to be aware of the ideological perspective that they may be getting from sources that would turn up in a Google search or would turn up in other ways in which they would go about finding this information.
Did they find that those sets of ideas were what came up as the highest hits on the Google searches?
Nobody looks after the first page.
Well,
in a Google
that's why
search.
I'm asking. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If
I don't recall that answer that specific question, but I do know that there was clearly in each of the memos a healthy portion of ideologically driven sources of evidence.
And we can get back to this, to how it relates to AI later, too, right?
So, Erik, one thing I want to ask, so you had the people write kind of the pro and then the con version of the memos. Did anyone's opinion change significantly or was moderated at least? Did you get any feedback like that from students?
Yeah, so I would do this. One of the things that I use in all the classes I teach, I call it using your clickers. We have small classrooms, and so on a scale of, raise your hand and put 5 fingers up for a 5 and agree with the most, and 1 is I disagree with the most. And so that's how I would get feedback on a lot of these things. And that's a question that I asked, is did anyone change their mind? And it was mainly kind of 2s and 3s, which is that they didn't really change their mind as much. That there were occasionally folks who, especially if it was on topics that were not as deeply connected to their kind of personal values and beliefs, then they may be more likely to change their mind. So, for example, a student may be more likely to change their mind with more information about whether student athletes should be paid, less likely to change their mind on abortion.
Right.
So
and that makes
a lot of it was topic driven. And that relates to a theory that I cover in some of the graduate classes that I teach on advocacy coalitions and belief systems and how that affects willingness for policy actors to kind of change their mind on policy opinions. And basically what it's got this nested set of beliefs, with the core belief is like, what is the role of government to be, big and active government or small and market driven. Those are pretty foundational beliefs. The second level may be specific policy beliefs on a topic. Do you think that college scholarships should be based on merit or based on need? And then the final one is, do you think that the income cap for a college scholarship should be $100,000 or $150,000 a year? Easier to agree on those secondary aspects, those minor policy ideas at the top, because it doesn't kind of shake the firm beliefs. And so that's what can lead to more incremental change over time, so that theory would say. So I think that's the concept that I saw play out in those policy memos.
How do we get college students as educators in the classroom to think more deeply, to think about alternative facts, or to dig deeper and look at both sides of things when they're writing a piece? What
I try to do in the class is to be intentional about about that. And so this dueling memo approach was trying to get at that, to force people to make arguments that they may not agree with, and that going through that exercise will kind of force them to engage with the different levels of evidence and how they might support that. Because I think all of us, and to some extent, are even scientists, it can be hard to be non-biased. Social scientists, I'll say in particular, and so there's a series of checks that we all go through to kind of make sure that our work is rigorous and meeting those standards. And so I think kind of modeling that through students or kind of going step by step with students can be helpful.
I mean, I think we do that as scientists too. When we're skeptical about looking at people's data, like what is their controls, right? So I think but younger students, how young do we start talking about critical thinking and skepticism and digging deep?
I mean, one way that I see this happening more, I'm sure across campus especially, is on how we engage with AI tools. And I think the alternative facts, one of the things that I found as I'm teaching this new first-year Odyssey course is that the examples that I used for alternative facts when I created that research evidence FYO in 2015, boy, there's a lot more examples of alternative facts now that there's AI, right? There's everything from the AI generated, pictures and memes and those type things that is much more prevalent now than it was even a decade ago. But there's also the hallucinations that occur, in references. I had many a student who, would in a graduate class who I asked them to go through it, forced them it was required that they go through an AI process. And they would turn in citations of my work that were not right. That was
were they just fabricated?
Yes, they were hallucinated. They were. I think we all. They were. They maybe got the title right, but they got everything else. The year and the co-authors and everything wrong. And so, kind of force people to use AI as a way and turn that in, as a way to kind of help inform their thinking and to make them more thoughtful users of information. And so the last year I taught that dueling memo assignment, we spent one class period where I asked everyone to come to class and to just ask AI ask ChatGPT to write your policy memo, and then come to class and let's talk about whether you think you could have turned that in and snowed me, or whether you think that it got, again, my 5-point scale, whether or not you think it was pretty solid or what problems existed. And the major problems were with the citations and the evidence. And even students who were maybe unfamiliar with their topic knew enough to question the evidence that AI was providing. And so I think that's something that's so now one of the things that I've tried to do in all the classes I teach is to be intentional and almost require students to go through some way of engaging with AI in that project so that it, kind of forces them to get experience with it, which I think is important, and also to realize that they're the ones who have to determine, make some judgments about the value of the information that they're getting.
You've convinced me that I should ask my FYO students how much they use AI. Actually, on the first day of class, I told them, look, I did a test and I found out that AI does a great job of summarizing the reading assignments I'm going to give you guys. And I won't be able to detect if it's you or them. I've mentioned this to Kim before, 4 years from now when you graduate, do you want to be the person that's just really good at writing ChatGPT prompts, or do you want to be the one that can think your way through a problem? We'll see how much effect that has.
Yeah. I think the university's making some really good strides there. We had, this AI FYO class that I taught. I had Meg Middlestead came in and met with the class. And one of the slides that she shared was the passive and strategic uses of AI, and the passive uses as being the standard kind of ones to, have ChatGPT do your homework, right? To summarize. Actually, summary can actually be a very strategic strategy in some ways. But I thought that was really interesting that there's some really good resources that the university has already for students and instructors that I know I've taken advantage of and learned a lot more about.
I suspect that most instructors on campus have not engaged much with AI.
I would agree with that too.
I don't know. I have no evidence for that, Eric. But
yeah. I think they just, from experience, I can say, for example, full disclosure, I used ChatGPT for the episode lead-in, and that's the kind of thing that I use it for. Maybe writing a letter,
kind of get ideas.
Just to get ideas, but I feed it in kind of what I'm looking for, right? And that's really all I use it for personally, but, I'm getting older. The technology is getting better, so I imagine that students are going to be using it, and we just have to figure that out. But I think David's right. So then the policy sometimes becomes you just can't use it, right? And that's what people do. And I think I'm glad to hear that the university is doing a better job at helping us understand as faculty members.
I think so. One of the more compelling things I heard is that, from, Alton Standifer, who, leads the AI Leadership Council, he said that they're getting a lot of feedback from students who've had internships and go into industry and are being asked to use AI tools to fulfill all of their work requirements.
Oh.
And so the idea is that we're actually setting our students up for success by having them, it doesn't mean that every class has to include it needs to be done appropriately, but the more that we can expose students to AI in appropriate ways and reinforcing that this is not a passive use, that they should be able to take advantage of these tools in ways that are strategic and consistent with what the objectives of the class are, or ultimately what their employers are going to want from them.
So based on my conversation that I just had about my kind of reluctance to use it, how familiar do you think that most faculty are with AI tools?
Yeah. I don't know. I would answer that by reflecting on my own use as well, and would say that I'm generally a late adopter. I'm generally, reluctant to be the, rarely I'm the first one with the new iPhone, never the first one with the new iPhone, but I recognize that this seems to be something different, and it's one of the reasons that I kind of sought to teach this class, because I knew it would force me to learn more about it and to think more about what this means for our field. And so I suspect that most faculty are curious and interested in AI. And I think we're creatures of habit in many good ways,
Right.
And so with a healthy dose of skepticism, which is also, part of, I think, being a faculty member in general, and so I don't know. I think it's shifting. I think folks are continuing to see value a little bit more. I'm not hearing as much of kind of the lock it down, don't use it, this too shall pass. I don't think that perspective is continuing to dwindle. That perspective,
Right.
And so active use, there's probably a range there.
I think it was just yesterday driving home, listening to NPR, they had a really nice news story on academic use of AI. And this was data, so it was data-driven, from Anthropic, one of the AI companies. And I know they looked at queries that came from accounts associated with a .edu address. So there was some validity there, although I think it was hard for them to know if it was students or faculty. But they used that as an intro into a discussion of use of AI in academia. And one person they were talking to presented the worst case scenario, which would be students using AI to write an assignment for which the professor uses AI to grade, which is kind of a zero-sum game.
Right.
I've never heard of that happening at UGA, and if I had kids here and I did hear that, I'd be upset. But
yeah, no, I think that, one of the things that I've taken away from it is that, transparency and intentionality are what's kind of most important there. And so, I think for example, something as simple as what the instructors being clear on what they see as kind of appropriate use of AI tools in their courses. The university has 3 different, recommended syllabus statements and it kind of ranges from highly permissive to more restrictive and something, in the middle. And so that I think helps. For me, I used the highly permissive one. It was the more that was aligned with what I kind of wanted to do for this AI FYO course, and and so I've encouraged students to use it more. I had one thing that I did in the first class is I used Copilot. The university has Copilot and Gemini and other tools that are available to everybody, and they're on closed loops, so they wouldn't have been included in that study because the data doesn't get out of it. So anyway, I had all this information that I was distilling from UGA websites, and I asked Copilot to generate a PowerPoint presentation about it. And I went through the PowerPoint presentation the first day of class, was going through everything, got to the end, and I said, would you be surprised to know that this whole PowerPoint slide was generated by AI? And they humored me and said, oh, I'm shocked. It looked so great, But, so it would be entirely unfair. I think the worst case is actually, it'd be if I did this and then I told them you can't use it at all.
Right.
And so that's what they kind of sniffed that out a little bit. And there was one of the things that students said is that would kind of be the worst, is if instructors are using it to design their PowerPoint presentations and grade their papers, but yet not letting students use it at all, and vice versa, So, but yeah, I hear what you're saying though. If both sides are using AI, what's the point? The computers can just talk to each other.
Yeah, I have a vision that in some online, say, master's programs or something, there's going to be virtual students who are basically just ChatGPT taking the course, which might be graded by ChatGPT.
Yeah,
right.
We had that exact dilemma in our department now because we just launched an fully online, asynchronous master's degree in higher education administration this fall. And this was a conversation that we've been developing it for 2 or 3 years now. And one of our dilemmas was, what if we never meet, even virtually, together on Zoom, and it's all assignments that are done in other ways. There are times when instructors and students, do meet synchronously, but the class doesn't meet, once a week at a certain time. And so we worked with folks at Online Education here who were really helpful in helping us to develop assignments that AI tools are not real good at, at being
Yet.
Right, yeah. That's true.
Exactly.
It is
So thinking about it outside the closed loops tools, right? We have all these open AI, and we talked about think tanks possibly, feeding into AI. Should we be teaching students how to ask unbiased questions in AI searches? So what I'm thinking about is, in general, how important is it to do that as well, right? So when it comes to, for example, science. So if I asked AI, for example, to list the side effects of a vaccine, right, that might be perpetuated as something that's very bad. And every time people ask about the side effects of a vaccine, they're going to get this long list of things. But perhaps the better question to ask, that might be the unbiased question, is how many people have a vaccine adverse reaction, right? Which then brings that number back, right? So it's the way that you're feeding and asking the questions into the system that I think could influence what we get out, right? Along with things like the think tanks. So do we have to also teach the students how to ask these unbiased questions? Or is that going to come back to haunt us, do you think? This is a big philosophical question.
Yeah.
It's kind of your last question.
Well, I do like the idea of thinking more about how to engage with AI, how to ask questions, and to be aware of how important the prompts that you give are to the responses that you receive. I think, one way that instructors might do that is requiring, if AI is used, requiring students to submit the prompts that they used. I know in the FYO class that I taught this semester, there's a video on UGA's AI library, I think, that has a whole section on writing prompts and tools and strategies for doing that. So I think that should be something that we talk more about. And I mean, Kim, where you really got me thinking is what are the kind of the think tanks or the intermediary organizations, is a term that we used some. What is their role in informing users of information? And so should these policy briefs or policy reports should it become standard practice to come with a set of recommendations on if folks are going to use AI tools to get information about this project, whether it's vaccines or other things, here are the prompts that we would recommend that are best associated with non-biased responses. Another possibility would be to go in the other direction and encourage people to use AI prompts that seek multiple perspectives on data. And so asking for what would critics of this, vaccine in this case, say, or what would proponents say, and getting more of that information could be interesting to understand better the sources of evidence that, may be more dealing. And I think the only hesitancy I have to this, and I just don't understand the AI technology as well at this point, is if that in some way feeds into the AI loop in a way that would promote misinformation, then I would have some caution about that. Barring that, I generally think that it's good practice to try to understand multiple perspectives as a way to, even if you're trying to understand multiple perspectives with the goal of convincing people that that may not agree with your scientific perspective, that could be helpful as well. And AI tools can help you do that in a way that talking with other scientists might not.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we have one question left, and that's when you're not thinking deeply about policy. What are you doing? I mean, other than fishing, Erik.
Yeah. I don't do a lot of fishing. I like to stay active. I've got 3 kids, and they're all active in sports and other activities, and so I enjoy most, watching them. I also enjoy running, and I like to play some golf too.
Well, with that, our guest today is Dr. Erik Ness, Director and Professor of Higher Education at the McBee Institute of Higher Education at UGA. Erik, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kim. Enjoyed being here.
Links to additional information about Dr. Ness's research can be found on our Instagram account, which is at PPPPodcastUGA.
As always, we appreciate you tuning in today, and if this is your first time listening to the People, Parasites, and Plagues podcast, we encourage you to check out the other exciting episodes launched this season. Please rate the podcast, and if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us via email at ppp@uga.edu. This podcast is brought to you by the Faculty of Infectious Diseases and the Grady College of Journalism at the University of Georgia. It is supported by the University of Georgia through the Office of Research, the UGA Graduate School, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. Special thanks to our production assistant, Justin Nemitz, for research, editing, scheduling, and keeping us on track.